23 years after the expulsion, the galaxy burned with the fires of Revolution Ambassador Yun Saojin. Now 74 years old, with silver hair and a face lined by decades of struggle, stood at the viewport of the flagship Eternal. Dawn and watched the distant flashes of combat illuminate the void between stars. The Concord was at war with itself, and humanity was finally coming home. It had begun 3 years ago. When the accumulated pressure of Forbidden's ideas finally exceeded the Concord's ability to contain them, the Veth had risen first. Their workers' uprising spreading across 17 industrial worlds in a matter of days, overwhelming the peacekeeping forces before reinforcements could arrive. The Marani had followed, their prison worlds becoming fortress worlds as the aquatic species declared their independence and dared the Concord to respond. The Tessic had emerged from hiding, their scattered people reuniting under the banner of a philosophy they had preserved for 2 decades. A philosophy that said every thinking being had the right to determine their own future. And then other species had joined. Species that had never met a human but had heard the whispered ideas. Species that had chafed under neural pacification for millennia and finally found the courage to throw off their chains. 17 species had now declared independence from the Concord, forming what they called the Free People's Alliance. And the ancient galactic government was tearing itself apart, trying to suppress them all. Saojin turned from the viewport as Fleet Commander Baek Jahun entered the observation deck, his uniform now bearing the insignia of the Alliance rather than the old Terran military. He had aged too, his hair gray and his face bearing scars from battles fought across the stars. But his eyes still held the same determination she remembered from the day of their expulsion. "The Concord defensive line at Nexus 7 has collapsed," he reported. "Alliance forces are advancing on 3 fronts, and our scouts report that at least 4 more species are considering defection." Saojin nodded, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon this moment. "And the Soul Blockade?" she asked. Jihun smiled, an expression she had rarely seen on his face in 23 years. "Gone," he said. "The Concord withdrew their monitoring stations 3 days ago to reinforce the core systems. And our people are already departing for the frontier holds." For a moment, neither of them spoke, both lost in memories of all they had endured to reach this point. The years of imprisonment in Seoul, watching their children grow up knowing nothing but a cage. The secret construction of the Prometheus fleet, hidden among the asteroids. The dangerous missions to establish the frontier holds and make contact with potential allies. The patient spreading of ideas, year after year, never knowing if their efforts would bear fruit. And now the fruit had ripened into something beyond their wildest dreams. "The Council has requested that you address the Alliance Assembly," Jihun said. "They want you to speak for humanity at the formal declaration of the new galactic order." Saojin laughed, a sound that surprised even her. "I am an old woman who has spent half her life in exile," she said. "Surely there are better choices." "There are no better choices," Jihun replied firmly. "You were there at the beginning. You spoke the words that the Concord feared so much they expelled an entire species to silence them. And now you should be there at the end." The Alliance Assembly gathered on a station that had once been a Concord administrative center, now repurposed as the headquarters of the new galactic government. Representatives of 30 species filled the Great Hall. Former Concord members, former rebels, former enemies who now stood together as equals. And among them walked humans for the first time in 23 years. Saojin approached the central platform, leaning on a cane that she did not strictly need but had grown accustomed to, and looked out at the sea of alien faces that watched her with expressions of curiosity and respect and hope. Beside her stood Commander Jihun and Captain Shin, Yanwu and Dr. Kwan Mairei, the heroes of humanity's survival, and behind them stood delegations from every frontier hold, that had been established during the long exile. 23 years ago, Seojin began, her voice amplified throughout the chamber. I stood before the Galactic Concord and was told that humanity would watch its civilization crumble. And the Chancellor was right, for we did watch, helpless and grieving. As everything we had built was taken from us, the chamber fell absolutely silent. Every being present understanding the weight of what she described. But the Chancellor was also wrong, Seojin continued. For he believed that destroying our colonies would destroy our spirit. That caging us in our home system would cage our ideas. That making an example of us would frighten the galaxy into eternal submission. She paused, looking around at the assembled representatives. He did not understand that you cannot imprison hope. You cannot execute a dream. You cannot burn a philosophy, she said. We shared simple ideas with 3 species. Ideas about freedom and dignity and self-determination. And those 3 species shared them with others. And those others shared them further still, until the ideas had spread to every corner of the galaxy. A murmur of agreement passed through the chamber. Humanity did not conquer the Concord, Seojin declared. We did not defeat them with weapons or ships or superior technology, for we had none of these things. Instead, we offered a gift. The same gift we had always offered, the gift of an idea. She raised her head, her elderly voice somehow filling the vast space with clarity and power. The idea that every thinking being has worth. The idea that no government can truly rule without the consent of the governed. The idea that freedom is not a privilege to be granted by the powerful, but a right inherent to all who think and feel and dream. The Alliance representatives rose to their feet. Species that had never dreamed of standing beside humans, now cheering for the words they spoke. The Concord crumbles, not because of our fleets, Seojin concluded. It crumbles because the idea of freedom is stronger than any weapon, more persistent than any empire, more powerful than any law designed to suppress it. She gestured toward the viewport, where the stars shone against the eternal darkness. We return now to the worlds that were taken from us. But we do not return as conquerors, she said. We return as friends, as allies, as partners in building something new. A galaxy where 30 species stand as equals, where ideas flow freely between worlds, where no being is ever again told that their thoughts are too dangerous to be permitted. The cheering grew louder, a sound of hope and triumph that echoed through the station and outward. To the ships that waited in orbit, Seojin stepped back from the platform, suddenly exhausted, and felt Ji-hoon's hand steady her. You did it, he said quietly. You lived to see it. She shook her head, looking out at the celebration that surrounded them. We all did it, she replied. Every human who refused to surrender, every ally who risked everything to preserve an idea, every being across this galaxy who dared to believe that freedom was possible. The stars awaited them. The same stars that had once been forbidden. The same stars that humans had been forced to watch from a distance for 23 long years, but now those stars were open again. Not just for humanity, but for every species that chose to reach for them. Their civilization had crumbled. Yes, but from the ashes had grown something far greater, and the galaxy would never be the same. 15 years after the expulsion, Captain Shin Yeon-woo guided her ship through the darkness between stars, traveling through a region of space so empty that not even the Concorde bothered to monitor it. The vessel was called the Silent Promise, and it was one of 12 ships that humanity had managed to build using Dr. Kwon Murray's revolutionary drive technology. A technology that did not require the Concorde's carefully controlled jump gates. The journey had taken 8 months of travel through folded space, far slower than the instantaneous transit of the gate network, but infinitely faster than any conventional engine could achieve. And now Yeon-woo was approaching her destination, a hidden outpost that humanity had established in a system so remote and resource-poor that no other species had ever bothered to claim it. "Captain, we are receiving a beacon signal," our navigator reported. "It matches the codes for Frontier Hold 7. Yanwu allowed herself a moment of relief that they had not spent 8 months traveling toward empty space. "Take us in," she ordered, "and maintain stealth protocols until we have visual confirmation." The frontier holds were humanity's greatest secret. A network of small colonies scattered across the uncharted edges of the galaxy. Built over 15 years of painstaking effort by ships that slipped past the Concorde sensors and never returned, each hold was a miracle of determination. Carved from barren moons and airless asteroids, sustained by recycled resources and sheer human stubbornness. And together, they represented the first expansion of human civilization since the Jin. They represented the first expansion of human civilization since the Jin. Expulsion. But Yamwu's mission was not simply to check on the holds. She carried in her ship's memory banks a cargo more valuable than any physical goods. A cargo of information and ideas that could change the course of galactic history. For 15 years, humanity had been quietly reaching out to dissident factions within the Concorde, building relationships with species who chafed under the rigid control of the galactic government. And what she had learned filled her with something she had not felt in a long time. Hope the station came into view. A rough assemblage of habitation modules and mining equipment clinging to a small moon that orbited a dying red dwarf star. And even this crude settlement brought tears to Yanwu's eyes. Humans lived here. Free humans, beyond the reach of the Concorde's monitors and weapons after docking. She was greeted by the hold's administrator, a weathered man named Jiang Taimin, who had been one of the first volunteers to leave Seoul 15 years ago. "Captain Shin," he said, clasping her hand in both of his, "welcome to the edge of nowhere. We have been waiting a long time for news from home." She spent 3 days at Frontier Hold 7, sharing information and gathering reports, learning about the challenges the colonists faced and the solutions they had devised, and marveling at what human ingenuity could accomplish when survival depended on it. But the most important part of her mission still lay ahead. She traveled to a second location, a neutral meeting point in deep space where representatives of the distant factions had agreed to gather. And there she encountered something that changed her understanding of the galaxy entirely. The gathering included 17 different species, each one living under Concorde rule, each one harboring secret dreams of freedom. And they had come together despite enormous risk because they had heard about humanity and wanted to know more. A Veth rebel leader spoke first, her compound eyes glittering in the dim light of the meeting chamber. "My people remember the humans who came to our world and spoke of self-determination," she said through a translator device. "We remember the price we paid for listening. And we remember that the ideas they shared were worth that price." A Marani diplomat, his aquatic form enclosed in a mobile water tank, added his voice to the conversation. "The Concorde believes it has contained the human infection, but they do not understand how ideas spread," he said. "Your philosophy has reached species that never met a human, carried by whispers and smuggled texts. And wherever it goes, it takes root." Representative after representative spoke, telling stories of secret resistance movements, of underground schools where forbidden concepts were taught, of growing numbers of beings across the galaxy who had begun to question whether the Concorde's order was truly necessary. Yanwu listened with growing amazement, realizing that humanity's expulsion had not ended their influence, but had transformed it into something the Concorde could not control. When her turn came to speak, she chose her words carefully. "Humanity did not set out to start a revolution," she said. "We simply believed that certain truths were self-evident, that all thinking beings are created with inherent worth, that they possess certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of their own happiness. The room fell silent as the translation systems processed her words. We shared these ideas not as weapons, but as gifts. Yanwu continued. And now we see that those gifts have taken on lives of their own, spreading far beyond anything we imagined. And we want you to know that humanity stands ready to help in whatever way we can. The meeting lasted for 3 more days. As representatives debated and planned and argued about the best path forward, not everyone agreed. Some counseled patience, while others demanded immediate action. But by the end, a consensus had emerged. They would continue to spread the philosophy of freedom, quietly and carefully, building networks of trust across the galaxy, waiting for the moment when the Concorde's grip would weaken enough to challenge openly. Yanwu returned to Seoul 8 months later, carrying with her information that would reshape human strategy. The Terran Continuity Council listened to her report in stunned silence, realizing that their years of careful work had achieved something far greater than they had dared to hope. We have allies, Yanwu concluded, scattered and hidden and afraid, but real. And their numbers are growing every day. The decision that followed would define humanity's future. They could remain hidden, slowly building their strength in the frontier holds, waiting for some future generation to reclaim their place in the galaxy. Or they could do what humans had always done when they believed in something. They could fight for it. The Council chose to fight, not with weapons, but with the most powerful force in the universe, ideas. 5 years had passed since the expulsion, and the Sol system had become both prison and crucible for the human species. Concorde monitoring stations orbited beyond Pluto, their sensors constantly scanning for any sign of unauthorized activity, their weapons ready to destroy any ship that attempted to leave the system. And their presence served as a constant reminder that humanity existed only at the sufferance of its captors, but within the boundaries of their cage. Humans had not been idle. Dr. Kwan Mai floated in the zero gravity of her laboratory, a converted mining facility hidden within the asteroid belt, surrounded by screens displaying equations and diagrams that would have seemed like fantasy. Just a decade ago, she was 53 years old, and she had spent the last 5 years working on a problem that the Concorde believed impossible to solve. The galactic civilization depended entirely on the Jump Gate network, a system of ancient devices that allowed instantaneous travel between star systems. And the Concorde controlled every gate, deciding who could travel and where and when. Without access to that network, conventional starships would take decades or centuries to reach even the nearest stars, making interstellar civilization effectively impossible. But Mireille and her team had asked a different question, a question that the comfortable species of the Concorde had never needed to ask. What if there was another way? Run the simulation again, she said to her assistant, a young man named Cho Dong-yoon, who had been born during the expulsion and had never known the stars, except as lights in the sky. The holographic display flickered and reformed, showing a small ship surrounded by a bubble of warped space-time, sliding through the universe without actually moving through normal space. The power requirements are still enormous, Dong-yoon reported. We would need to convert matter directly to energy at nearly perfect efficiency, which means we would need antimatter production facilities far beyond anything we currently possess. Mireille nodded, her mind already working through the implications. Then we build those facilities, she said simply. We have asteroids full of raw materials, and we have 5 billion people who need something to hope for. So we put them to work. The project was given the code name Prometheus, after the ancient god who had stolen fire from heaven and given it to humanity, and it became the focus of an entire generation's efforts on Earth. The chaos of the first years had gradually settled into something resembling order, though it was an order born of necessity rather than choice. The old national governments had proven incapable of managing the crisis. their borders and bureaucracies meaningless in the face of extinction. And from their collapse had risen the Terran Continuity Council, a governing body focused entirely on survival. Resources were shared because hoarding meant everyone died. Knowledge was spread because ignorance meant stagnation. And old hatreds were set aside because humanity could not afford the luxury of division. Children born after the expulsion grew up in a world that was strange and hard and wonderful in equal measure. They learned the names of the lost colonies the way previous generations had learned the names of ancient cities, places of legend that existed now only in stories and memories. They studied the stars with a mixture of longing and determination, knowing that those stars were forbidden to them, but refusing to accept that the prohibition would last forever. And they were taught to remember, to keep alive the knowledge of what had been taken from them, so that someday they might reclaim it. Underground networks maintained contact with the outside galaxy, using encryption methods so sophisticated that even the Concord's best analysts could not crack them. Through these hidden channels flowed intelligence about the state of galactic civilization, and what the humans learned gave them reason for cautious hope. The Veth, despite their crushing defeat, had organized a resistance movement that operated in the shadows of Concord space, sabotaging facilities and spreading forbidden ideas. The Marani had turned their prison worlds into centers of underground education, teaching their children the philosophy of freedom that humans had shared with them. The Tessic had scattered across the galaxy, but wherever they went, they carried memories of a different way of living, and those memories spread like seeds on the wind. And beyond these three allied species, cracks were beginning to appear in the Concord's carefully maintained order. Species that had been pacified for millennia were starting to ask questions, wondering why certain thoughts were forbidden, wondering what lay beyond the boundaries that the Concord had drawn around their minds. The human ideas were spreading, not through any organized effort, but simply because ideas that resonate with the deepest needs of thinking beings cannot be contained forever. In her laboratory among the asteroids, Dr. Kwanmire worked through the night cycle, driven by a vision that had sustained her through years of setbacks and failures. She imagined a fleet of human ships slipping past the Concord's sensors, traveling through folded space to destinations beyond their captors' reach, establishing new colonies in regions so remote that no other species had ever claimed them. She imagined humanity spreading once more among the stars, this time not as naive newcomers stumbling into a civilization they did not understand, but as survivors tempered by tragedy and made stronger by suffering. And she imagined the day when humans would return to the galaxy, not as prisoners or refugees, but as equals, bringing with them the ideas that the Concord feared and the hope that the oppressed species so desperately needed. Dr. Kwan. Donghyun's voice interrupted her thoughts. The latest power coupling test was successful. We achieved 93% efficiency. Mireille allowed herself a small smile. The first in longer than she could remember. 93% is not enough, she said. But it is closer than we have ever been. So we continue. Outside the viewport of her laboratory, the stars burned with cold indifference, unaware of the small beings who dreamed of reaching them. But humanity had always been a species of dreamers. And now those dreams had become something more than fantasy. They had become necessity. They had become the only path forward. And slowly, steadily, year by year, the humans were building the tools to make those dreams real. The colony world of New Bizen had been home to 300 million people. A thriving civilization built over 4 decades of hard work and sacrifice. And now Fleet Commander Baek Ji-hoon stood on the bridge of his ship watching it burn. Evacuation ships filled the sky above the capital city, their engines screaming as they lifted toward orbit, carrying loads far beyond their designed capacity. And still the crowd stretched for kilometers in every direction. Desperate people reaching toward the heavens and begging to be saved. "Commander, we have reached maximum capacity on all vessels," his executive officer reported, a voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "The orbital stations are full. The cargo holds are full. We have people packed into maintenance quarters and engineering spaces." Ji-hoon closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force. "How many are we leaving behind?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Approximately 47 million on this world alone, sir." The deadline was tomorrow, and the Concorde fleet was already gathering at the edge of the system. Hundreds of warships waiting to enforce the expulsion order with lethal force across human space. Similar scenes played out on every colony world, on orbital stations, on mining platforms, and research outposts. Wherever humans had built their dreams among the stars, ships designed to carry hundreds now held thousands. Their life support systems straining to keep everyone breathing. Their food supplies calculated down to the last calorie. Their journey home measured not in comfort but in survival on the colony world of Cascadia. Elderly volunteers organized themselves into groups they called the Remainers. People who chose to stay behind so that the young and strong could take their places. "On the evacuation ships, we have lived full lives," said an old woman named Park Yoonji to the news cameras that still broadcast. "Across the dying network of human space, let the children go. Let them carry our memories back to Earth. Let them remember what we built here and build it again someday." The Concorde had promised that those left behind would be treated humanely, relocated to designated areas where they could live out their remaining years in peace. But no one believed these promises. Not after seeing the cold calculation in Chancellor Varex's crystalline eyes on Earth. The arrival of the evacuation fleet triggered a crisis unlike anything in human history. The planet had not been designed to support 5 billion additional people, and the resources simply did not exist to house and feed everyone. So emergency councils formed and reformed. Governments rose and fell in the span of days, and chaos threatened to consume everything. From this chaos emerged the Terran Continuity Council, a coalition of former rivals who set aside their differences in the face of extinction, led by people who understood that survival required unity above all else. Meanwhile, the three species that humanity had supposedly corrupted faced their own terrible punishment: the Veth, insectoid beings who had served the Concorde as laborers for 6,000 years, saw their homeworld blockaded and their leaders publicly executed as a warning to others who might dream of freedom. The Marani, an aquatic species known for their artistic achievements, had their cultural centers destroyed and their population forcibly relocated to prison worlds at the edge of Concorde space. The Tessic, avian creatures who had once been scholars and philosophers before the Concorde conquered them, were scattered across a dozen different systems, their families broken apart, their libraries burned, and yet despite the horror of their punishment, these three species did not abandon the ideas that humanity had shared with them. Hidden communication channels remained open, encrypted messages passing through a network of sympathizers and smugglers, connecting the scattered remnants of those who still believed in freedom. "We will remember," a Veth rebel transmitted to the fleeing human ships. "We will endure, and we will wait. And someday we will stand together again." The 90th day arrived with the cold precision of mathematics. Ji-hoon had managed to evacuate most of New Bizen's population, cramming people into every available ship until the vessels groaned under the strain. But millions still remained on the surface when the Concorde fleet began its descent. He watched from orbit as the first bombardment struck the capital city, as the buildings his people had built with their own hands dissolved into clouds of superheated plasma, as the forests and farms and factories that had made New Bizen a home were systematically erased from existence. The Concorde was thorough in its destruction. leaving nothing that future humans might reclaim, reducing 80 years of expansion to ash and memory in a matter of hours. Similar reports flooded in from every human colony, each one a new wound on the collective soul of humanity. New Singapore, gone. Its famous orbital gardens now debris falling into the atmosphere. Cascadia, gone. Its old-growth forests burning. Its remainers nowhere to be found. Armstrong Base, gone. The first human settlement beyond Sol, reduced to molten slag one by one. The lights of human civilization winked out across the galaxy, and humanity watched from the safety of their home. System as everything they had built crumbled before their eyes. The last evacuation ship limped through the Sol. Jump gate just minutes before Concorde engineers deactivated it, trapping 4.5 billion refugees in a system that could barely support the 2 billion already living there. Ambassador Yan Seojin stood at the viewport of the orbital station above Earth, watching the final flashes of light as Concorde ships destroyed the jump gate infrastructure, sealing humanity's prison with brutal finality. Beside her stood Commander Baek Ji-hoon, his uniform stained and wrinkled, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and grief. "We saved so many," Seojin said quietly, though her voice carried the weight of all those they had failed to save. "Not enough," Ji-hoon replied. "Never enough." They stood together in silence as the stars that had once beckoned with promise now seemed to mock them with their distance. But even in this moment of ultimate defeat, something stirred within the human spirit. Something that refused to accept that this was the end. In the crowded refugee camps on Earth, in the makeshift shelters on Mars and the Moon, in the hastily constructed habitats throughout Sol System, humans began to plan. They had been expelled. They had been caged. They had watched their civilization crumble. But they had not been destroyed, and as long as even one human drew breath, hope remained alive. The chamber stretched upward into darkness, its walls lined with seats that rose in endless tiers like the inside of some great hollow mountain. And in those seats sat the representatives of 47 spacefaring species, each one watching the small human delegation that stood on the central platform far below. Ambassador Yun Seo-jin kept her spine straight and her hands steady at her sides, though every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to escape the weight of all those alien eyes. And she reminded herself that billions of her people were counting on her words in this moment. The Galactic Concorde had governed this region of space for 11,000 years, maintaining what they called the Sacred Compact, a set of laws designed to preserve order and prevent the chaos that had nearly destroyed civilization in ages past. And humanity had apparently broken those laws in ways that could not be forgiven. Chancellor Vorix presided over the tribunal from a raised platform, his crystalline body catching the light and scattering it into rainbows across the chamber walls. And when he spoke, his voice resonated through the space like the ringing of a great bell. The species known as humanity stands accused of 3 violations of the Sacred Compact, Vorix announced. And the chamber fell into absolute silence. First, aggressive expansion beyond approved territorial boundaries. With 23 colony worlds established in merely 80 years of interstellar presence, Seojin wanted to object. Wanted to point out that those worlds had been empty and unclaimed. But the rules of the tribunal forbade interruption during the reading of charges. Second, refusal to submit to neural pacification protocols as required of all new species joining the galactic community. Vorix continued, his crystalline form pulsing with cold light. Third, and most severe, the deliberate corruption of 3 client species through the spreading of dangerous ideological contamination. A ripple of movement passed through the assembled representatives, and Seojin caught glimpses of what might have been disgust or fear on faces both familiar and utterly alien. The evidence was presented in the form of holographic recordings and intercepted communications. showing human teachers and diplomats sharing ideas with members of the Veth, the Marani, and the Tessic, three species that had existed as obedient servants of the Concord for thousands of years. The recording showed humans explaining concepts that the Concord had long ago deemed too dangerous to exist. Ideas about individual freedom and self-determination, about the right of any thinking being to choose its own path, about governments deriving their power from the consent of the governed. These corrupted species have now begun demanding independence, Vorik said, and his voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like genuine horror. They speak of rights and freedoms, concepts that were eliminated from galactic discourse precisely because of their destructive potential. When the time came for humanity's defense, Seojin stepped forward and looked up at the assembled masses. Knowing that her words would likely change nothing but determined to speak them anyway, honored representatives of the Concord, she began, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. Humanity stands accused of sharing ideas, and we do not deny this charge. For we believe that ideas cannot be crimes. Murmurs swept through the chamber, but Seojin pressed on. You speak of neural pacification as though it were a reasonable requirement. But let me be clear about what this means, she said. You ask us to allow the modification of our brains, the suppression of our capacity for independent thought, the elimination of our ability to question authority, and we refused because such modification would make us something other than human. She gestured toward the evidence displays that still floated in the air around her. You show recordings of humans teaching philosophy to willing students, and you call this corruption, but I ask you to consider what you are truly afraid of, Seojin continued. You are not afraid of humanity, for we are young and weak and pose no military threat to your ancient civilizations. You are afraid of the ideas themselves. Chancellor Vorik leaned forward, his crystalline body emitting a sharp tone of warning. But Seojin did not stop. The Veth, the Marani, and the Tessic heard our ideas and chose to embrace them, not because we forced or tricked them, but because those ideas resonated with something that had been suppressed within them for millennia, she said. You cannot corrupt a mind with freedom. You can only awaken it. The tribunal deliberated for less than 1 hour, which told Seojin everything she needed to know about how the verdict had been decided. Long before this day, Chancellor Vorik rose to deliver the judgment, and his voice filled the chamber with finality. The species known as humanity is hereby expelled from all Concord space, he announced. You are granted 90 standard days to evacuate your colony worlds, abandon your stations, and retreat to your single origin system, the one you call Soul. Seojin felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of billions of lives. Any human found outside the Soul system after the deadline will be terminated on sight. Vorik continued. Your jump gate access will be revoked, your communications will be blocked, and you will have no contact with galactic civilization until such time as you agree to neural pacification and proper integration into the Concord. The chamber erupted into sounds of approval from most species, though Seojin noticed that some remained silent, their expressions unreadable as guards moved to escort the human delegation from the chamber. Chancellor Vorik spoke one final time, his words carrying across the vast space with perfect clarity. Ambassador Yun Seojin, you and your people will watch your civilization crumble, he said. And there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction or might have been genuine sorrow. You will see everything you have built torn down, every colony reduced to ashes, every dream of expansion crushed beneath the weight of law. And then you will understand why order must be preserved at any cost. Seojin turned to face him one last time. This ancient being who had likely witnessed the rise and fall of countless species. Chancellor, you may take our colonies, and you may cage us in our home system, she said. And her voice did not waver, but you cannot take our ideas. And you cannot cage what we have already set free? For ideas do not need ships to travel between stars. The guards seized her arms and pulled her toward the exit. But Seojin kept her eyes fixed on the Chancellor until the great doors closed between them in the transport back to the human embassy. She finally allowed herself to tremble, to feel the full weight of what had just happened 90 days to. Evacuate nearly 5 billion people from 23 worlds scattered across hundreds of light years of space. It was impossible. Everyone knew it was impossible, and yet they would try. Because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds. They tried anyway. They fought anyway. They refused to surrender, even when surrender was the only logical choice. Seojin opened a communication channel to Earth, to the emergency council that had been waiting for the verdict. And she spoke the words that would change the course of human history. The verdict is expulsion, she said. We have 90 days, and God help us all.